think we're pretty much doing ourselves out of a job, so it's so wonderful when people like Vanda are able to introduce and bring your own interpretations to our scriptural passages. Thank you. When the First World War erupted in 1914, the United States President Woodrow Wilson pledged neutrality, favoring a negotiated collective approach to international stability. But by early April 1917, with unrestricted attacks against all ships that entered the war zone around Britain, including American ships, and with rising civilian casualties, Wilson asked Congress for a war to end all wars that would make the world safe for democracy. On April the 6th, 1917, Congress voted to declare war on Germany and to join what was then optimistically called the Great War. 2 days later, following America's entry into the war, J. Leonard Levy, a British-born Jews College-trained rabbi who had emigrated to the United States after serving at Bristol Hebrew congregation for 4 years, gave a sermon entitled "A Time for War and a Time for Peace," quoting from Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. Until then, Levy, who was an elected vice president of the International Peace Union and who had previously organized an international conference for peace in his synagogue in Pittsburgh, the Reform congregation Rodef Shalom, where he remained until his death in 1917, had consistently spoken out against war and advocated pacifism. In 1914, he had spelt out the implications of this position. If the United States government, he said, had the right to draft me today into an army, I would refuse to serve. However, on the second day of Pesach, 1917, America now at war with Germany, he concluded his lengthy address invoking the overthrow of Egyptian tyranny, the downfall of Pharaoh, and the emancipation of the Hebrew slaves with the words, "The time for peace will come. Let us prepare against its coming. The time for war is here. Let us serve our nation in the spirit of the great leader whose words have moved us to action." In this volte-face from his convictions as a pacifist, Levy embraced what he called the pursuit of the business in hand until we have brought the American undertaking to a successful issue. The time for war found him, together with his congregation, turning his back on what he described as the deepest respect for all that Germany was doing for humanity in the field of medicine, science, industrial chemistry, and biochemistry, and in its social programs. All this, he said, has now received a severe setback from which they will not recover for years to come. Moral values have been disturbed. Faith has been rudely shocked. Levy appealed to his congregants, regardless of their places of birth, to be Americans first and to recall their allegiance to the United States. The issue here, as Rabbi Professor Mark Saperstein points in a little commentary to this sermon, was not American identity before Jewish identity, but rather American identity before the German identity derived from the early years of immigrants from Germany. This call to be Americans is followed by a theological discourse in which Levy appeals to his listeners not to blame God for the war. Clearly, there were those who were shocked by the suffering caused by the disaster of the First World War. How is it possible that a good God can tolerate such things to exist? If he is omnipotent, why does he not interfere and stop the war? Levy responds to that question, responds that a question such as this arises out of human anguish in the presence of apparently irredeemable suffering. God does not want war, he says, quoting scriptural verses that refer to an era of world peace. The fruit of righteousness shall be peace. It is not God, he argues, who desires war, but man. And the theme he returns to again and again in his 17-page address is that humanity has not organized for peace as they have organized for war. And referring to the Sermon on the Mount in the New Testament, that the assaulted nation or nations might have turned the other cheek, he argues, but while the ethics of the dominant religion, Christianity, may teach men to turn the other cheek, to resist no evil, to bless those who curse them, to pray for those who evilly despise them, society has never accepted such a code of ethics, and as long as society endures, it never will, for society is rooted in justice and not in non-resistance. Actually, Rabbi Saperstein says that most Christian preachers at the time saw this verse of turning the other cheek as referring only in individual cases rather than in national, international cases. Law, says Levy, means resistance to evil, opposition to wrong, personal, national, international. The ethics of non-resistance are adapted to a society which believes that the world is momentarily about to come to an end. Such principles are not adapted to a society which regards its future as enduring. What struck me particularly about this address was not necessarily the about turn that Levy made from passivism to willing service as a citizen of his chosen country, but a robustness in the way that he holds together a vision of peace and the necessity of war at that moment in his time. The vision of peace emanates from an absolute, unchanging standard of morality, he says, that is the will of God, a divine standard of righteousness and justice and equity that is eternally the same, while humanity aspires progressively to an aspiration to do the will of God. Levy tolerates, if that is the right word, maybe could use an even stronger word there, the necessity of war and its brutishness. He acknowledges the hellish nature of war and how it, I quote, lets loose all the pent-up hates and passions of men. Levy sees war as a temporary reversion to what long since might have been an extinct barbarism. And yet, he says, this is the time for war. All are required to make the sacrifices of war. All must die, all must suffer, all must sacrifice, all must endure pain at some time or other. These phases of the horrors of war affright only the weak." End of quote. At the same time as urging his congregants to serve the cause of the war, he can also argue that he believes in peace, that he believes, I quote, in the world dream of international peace, just as much today as ever before. And in invoking Isaiah and Amos and other prophetic texts that see peace and justice going hand in hand, he highlights the damaging and repulsive theories of German extreme nationalist philosophers such as Heinrich von Treitschke or von Bernhardi, a German military historian and belligerent, who against the scriptural teachings of love of God and love of one's neighbor, argued that nothing exists or can exist which is superior to the state. It is in times like these, when morality teeters on a frightening precipice, that we need to find a meaningful shape to our theology, our thoughts, our beliefs. Is war always a necessity? Is death and lifelong injury and trauma the way to make the world a safe place? Does destruction of lives and cities, of trees, of the earth and living creatures provide an enduring peace, a durable peace? Are the instruments of war more powerful than the prophet's words, that swords will be beaten into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks, and everyone shall sit under their vine and under their fig tree, and none shall make them afraid? Today's commemoration of Armistice Day reminds us of the immense loss of life in the wars of the 20th century, and also in these first 2 decades and more of the 21st century. It reminds us of the ways in which wars can change the geopolitical, social, industrial, technological landscapes of nations. When our eyes and mind are focused on the immense scale of destruction, we are too often diverted from the individual acts of kindness, courage, compassion, and humanity. It is inevitable as we mark the 105th anniversary of the signing of the armistice on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour, and stand in silence to remember the millions who have died, that we turn our minds to the current wars between Russia and Ukraine, between Israel and Hamas, wars that have left so many bereaved and traumatized, unable to see what the future will hold. I want to end with a quotation from a book written by a Palestinian doctor, Izzeldin Abu Laish, in the aftermath of Israel's incursion into Gaza in 2009, during which 3 of his daughters and his niece were killed. Out of the great tragedy that befell his family, he concludes his book, I Will Not Hate, in this way. This catastrophe of the deaths of my daughters and niece has strengthened my thinking, deepened my belief about how to bridge the divide. I understand down to my bones that violence is futile. It is a waste of time, lives, and resources, and has been proven only to beget more violence. It does not work. It just perpetuates a vicious cycle. There's only one way to bridge the divide, to live together, to realize the goals of 2 peoples. We have to find the light to guide us to our goal. Light as a symbol of truth. To find the light of truth, you have to talk to, listen to, and respect each other. Instead of wasting energy on hatred, use it to open your eyes and see what's really going on. Surely, if we can see the truth, we can live side by side. May his words in time find their fulfillment, when we shall cease preparing ourselves for a time of war and prepare ourselves for a time for peace. Amen.